Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I've found in my travels. Today, I want to talk about a book that I read. It is a book that has been on my TBR for 2022, and I am like 10 months in, or not 10 months, 9 months in. I'm finally getting to it. It is a book about Roman rulers, and also it's a little bit about historical fan fiction. I am referring to Augustus by John Williams, which was published in 1972. For those who don't know, and I've talked about John Williams on this channel before, he is an American writer known for writing really only 4 novels in his lifetime. He was in academia and he dropped out and he started writing, and he often wrote about men in particular at crucial crisis points in their lifetime and how they deal with large amounts of pressure and stress. You may recall my video, if you're a longtime viewer, you may recall my viewer about Stoner, which I consider to be one of the best books ever written. Not only, that I've talked about on this channel, but just in general. It's a really amazing book that is about, mundanity. It's about a man who lives an inconsequential life and it seemingly is pushed over, steamrolled at any opportunity. And the question is ultimately, is his life important? Is life meaningful? Does anything matter? And it asks a lot of really deep questions, and I love the book. It's one of my favorite books, and I really think I developed a passion for reading more from John Williams as a result of it, and so I wanted to explore more here. And what I ended up doing was deciding to read Augustus without knowing what I was getting into. And Augustus is a bit unusual because it is essentially it's a series of letters. Forced into a narrative that tells a story about the life of Augustus Caesar, which is a really interesting way of writing a story. You can't fault John Williams for not being creative in that regard, but you can fault him for a couple of other things, which I'll talk about later in the video. So yeah, a very interesting author, one that I definitely recommend you check out if you haven't done so already. And without further ado, let's talk about Augustus. I will read it, do a little bit of analysis, and we'll move on from there. So Augustus focuses on Augustus Caesar, otherwise known as Octavian Caesar, and the story is told in the form of letters, as I mentioned previously, that are written to Augustus or to the people in his life, written about Augustus, their historical edicts, just general summaries of history, and you even hear from Augustus once or twice, which is interesting, and another thing I'll talk about later. So the story is kind of told in that structure. And it begins with Caesar talking about training him, wanting to mold him into a leader, especially one with military prowess. But it doesn't seem like Augustus is really taking to it because that's not the life that he wants to lead. Although Julius Caesar has adopted him at this point and plans to make him the next in line for leadership of Rome. Fortunately, Julius Caesar is killed by a bunch of assassins in the Senate, and this spurs Augustus to avenge him on his behalf, although he's kind of forced into it because Caesar's enemies also target him. They don't believe him to be a threat at first, but once he indicates that he is going to stand against these men who wish to take over Rome, they decide that something has to be done. And Augustus forms an uneasy alliance with Mark Antony, otherwise known as Antonius, and they don't really like each other, but they have to work together because the assassins have turned against them. Eventually, the assassins are killed, and the triumvirate, which is Antonius, Augustus and Lepidus, like they work together to try to lead Rome through all three of them. And Augustus tries to make things easier by marrying off his sister Octavia to Antonius, but Antonius doesn't seem very happy with the relationship, nor does he seem very happy with the power that he was kind of forced into. And he ends up turning to Cleopatra, who has her own aims of taking over Rome and growing her army and leading Egypt to a new glory that it hasn't seen in quite some time. And Antonius eventually turns against Rome and Octavia and plans to lead an army to take over. But this is actually a mistake because a lot of the people in Rome don't want to fight against their own people, or like even in Mark Antony's army don't want to fight against other Romans. And so many people side with Octavius, and this leads to the triumvirate falling apart. Lepidus is forced into exile, and Mark Antony is killed along with Cleopatra, who commits suicide. Augustus is ultimately victorious, and after quashing a few civil wars and rebellions, he is able to fully take over Rome and has to begin arranging marriages to consolidate his power. And this is where we're really introduced to Julia, his daughter. He loves his daughter, but he becomes distant from her because he marries her off to people that she's not really in love with. Her first husband either dies or she gets divorced from him, and her second husband is Marcus Agrippa, who she is fond of, but she begins cheating on him. And everyone is kind of aware of it, although they don't say it out loud because there are infidelity laws, which funnily enough Augustus created, that make it so that if you acknowledge that, you have to exile or kill the person who's doing the cheating. Eventually, after Marcus Agrippus dies, the Claudius family is trying to gain power, and so Julia is end up put into a relationship with Tiberius Nero, who she absolutely doesn't like and actively cheats on. Doesn't really try to hide it in the process. Eventually it's found out that some of Augustus's enemies were trying to assassinate him, and also Tiberius Nero in the process, although I think there's some scheming going on Nero's part, and Julia might be tied to it, so rather than putting her to death, Augustus kind of announces her infidelities and sends her into exile, which she is grateful for not being killed, but also it feels like this is yet another distancing from her father. And so, the rest of Augustus's life goes forward, and then near the end of his life, he writes a letter to Nicholas of Damascus, a sort of friend that he's had since he gained power in Rome. And in the letter, he reveals that he's actually been cynical this whole time, and that he's made a lot of choices. And although a lot of people have said this whole leadership thing was forced upon him and not his chosen path, he actually reveals that it was his chosen path, and that he's manipulated quite a bit in order to make things happen the way that he's wanted to happen. And although he's seen as a divine and a pretty good ruler, he's done a number of terrible things. And one of the weirdest and saddest things about this is he pretty much admits he doesn't think Rome is going to last because of the weakness that exists in men's hearts. And he, after revealing that, and the letter is sent to Nicholas, who it turns out is dead, Octavius dies in his old childhood home. And as the story comes to an end, it kind of flashes forward to around 60 AD in Rome, where his former doctor is talking to Seneca. And they note that, there is some hope for Rome, even though it's had some bad rulers after Augustus, particularly Claudius, and a couple of other pretty terrible rulers. But they note that they do have hope that the next ruler can proceed forward and fulfill Augustus's vision of a better Rome. But they note that the next ruler is Nero, and as we all know, that doesn't turn out so well. And that's where the story ends there. In terms of analysis, there is quite a bit to talk about with this story. A lot of ideas that John Williams is working with pretty successfully, and I do think that it partially saves this story, that he's able to work with such big themes and make it we're given that this is historical characters who might not normally fit into these roles that he seems to be shoving them into. But one idea that he's working with is that of the young leader, who kind of doesn't have an opportunity to do anything else but be this leader. Augustus is forced to take on this power. He's forced to take on the role of Rome's leader, of the military commander at such a young age, at 18. And I know, like, back then, people, like, they reached adulthood much younger, and so, like, he might have, like, had some time to be a young adult, like, pretty early, and especially because he had money too. But like, once he hits 18, he's immediately forced into combat, forced into war for several years, pretty much from the year 44 to the year 27 BCE. And after that, he's forced to deal with people who are trying to grab power. He's got to manipulate and make marriages happen. There's pretty much no time for Augustus to do anything for himself. It's always in service of Rome. And that's very interesting because he, like, they're like, usually, like, at like 18, like, people would want to be doing other things. They'd want to explore themselves and see what life can offer them, but Augustus doesn't have this opportunity. There's a good quote that I would like to read to you from this. "He is a man like any other," he said. "He will become what he will become out of the force of his person and the accident of his fate." So kind of highlighting that as a young leader, like, he's going to try to make things happen, but he's often, like, it's the accident of his fate. Like, Caesar was killed, and that forced him to take on this role that he might not have wanted, which I think is very, very interesting, that, like, maybe Augustus's life didn't turn out the way he wanted, especially at such a young age. And there was no life for him outside of war or regal duties. Like, he's always been living in service of something else and never had any time for himself. Which, especially at the end of the story, we see, you know, like, maybe he has some regrets about that. Like, he loved the power, he loved leading Rome, but there's always, like, something else that you could want. You wouldn't want to be exposed to all of these people, especially at such a young age. And I do think there are parallels with Julia, his daughter, in this story, because Julia is also forced into being this regal woman at such a young age, forced into these relationships she doesn't want to be with, not able to really hang out with her friends without facing strict scrutiny from her father or from the men that she's with. So Augustus may have wanted to skip that for Julia, but it was never really possible for her given his emperorship of Rome. And then the same thing applies to Mark Antonius, who it seems like he only ever wanted to be a soldier or like a military leader. And because of Caesar's death, he was forced into being this triumvirate leader. And he doesn't want to do it. Like, the moment he gets a chance, he heads to Cleopatra and begins a relationship with her and just shirks his duty as a Roman ruler. And everyone kind of notes that, like, he's not cut out for this leadership role. And so I do think it's like this boy or girl interrupted kind of thing where, like, you want to be a free and gentle spirit living the best life you can, but your responsibilities are always getting in the way. And another interesting thing about this story is the theme of, like, man versus emperor. Like, the man Augustus versus the emperor Octavius, the divine being who is seen as a god, as a descendant of Julius Caesar, who was also seen as a god. And you can see already there, like if people expect you to be a god, if people expect you to be divine all the time, that puts a lot of pressure on you, because the moment you fail, people are going to jump on you and attack and try to claim any of that power that you seemingly have. There's no room for him to have any vulnerability. Like, he can't be sad in public about a friend's death. He can't show any other side of him, because if he does, that doesn't fit with the image he's trying to create, and that leaves more room for people to attack the family. There's another interesting quote that I would like to read to you here. "And she hinted that too much grief was unseemly from the person of the emperor. My father looked at her gravely and said, 'Then the emperor will show that grief that befits an emperor, but how shall the man show the grief that befits him?' And it seemed like a little bit of a joke, but Augustus is saying, like, yeah, as an emperor, I'm not allowed to show grief, but my friends died. Like, the people I love are dying all around me. Should I just keep that bottled in? Like, what is the man behind the emperor allowed to do? And I think it's really, really, really good writing on John Williams's part, that he was able to capture that aspect of the emperor, that, like, sometimes we place these divine symbols upon people, like this divine representation, and we forget that they're actually human. Another interesting element of this story is the idea of the real Augustus. The story is written from the perspective of people who knew him, and it's very obvious that right away we don't hear a lot from Augustus, apart from dictated memoirs or a short letter here and there. We don't really get insight into who Augustus is. So we mainly just hear people talking about him, what he was like, and saying, oh, he must have felt sad here. So kind of projecting emotions on them based on what they themselves might have felt in a similar situation. And as you're reading the story, you have to ask, is this a bit of an unreliable narrator situation, where the narrator in this case is everyone around him? And I think to some extent, yes. Like, if this is all you would see in the story, we'd be dealing with an unreliable narrator. We can't really take what they're saying at face value, because people are always secretive, and unless you're living as that person, you don't know what they're thinking or what emotions they're going through. So, and even though these people are close to Augustus, we don't really get a feel for what he's truly experiencing, at least as we see it through their eyes. And what I think is really clever is what John Williams does at the end, where the entire third act is just devoted to Augustus, talking about his life as he writes a letter to Nicholas of Damascus. The true Augustus is revealed at the end of the story, where he says pretty much that he wasn't really fond of certain people, and he doesn't have a lot of hope for Rome, and he kind of chose this life. Like, people say it was thrust upon him, but he made the choices to get to that path. There's another interesting quote that I would like to read to you from this. "And just as the acts of my life have done, so these words must conceal at least as much truth as they display. The truth will lie somewhere beneath these graven words, in the dense stone which they will encircle. And this too is appropriate, for much of my life has been lived in such secrecy. It has never been politic for me to let another know my heart." And that's a really fascinating quote for two reasons. One, it shows that Augustus was a secretive person, and not many people knew what he was thinking. But it also kind of undermines everything else we've been hearing just before from all these people who claim to have known him or understood what was in his heart. Because if he's saying it's never been politic, it's never been his method of letting people know what's inside him, then can we take anything they're saying for what it is? Is this simply mad guessing at what they think is going through the mind of Augustus? I certainly believe so. And I think that's kind of brilliant on the part of John Williams, because it shows how we often, just assume what's going through people's minds. Especially when people have a lot of power, maybe we develop some sort of parasocial relationship with them. I don't know if that would ever happen for anyone in this story, but we sort of assume what they're thinking, even though that might not actually be what they're thinking. And Augustus also says that his life was not an accident. That as I mentioned before, a lot of people say this was just fate, but he made a lot of choices to bring about this. And he says so as much in this. Allow me to read you another quote from this. "When I was young, I would have said that loneliness and secrecy were forced upon me. I would have been in error, as most men do. I chose my life then. I chose to enclose myself in the half-formed dream of a destiny no one could share, and thus abandon the possibility of that kind of human friendship, which is so ordinary that it is never spoken of, and thus is seldom cherished." And I think that's a really interesting quote. Again, one, because it shows that he is kind of friendless, but that friendlessness, number two, is something that he chose. He made these decisions, and he strategized. Went through a thought process of everything that led him to this point. None of this was an accident. It was predetermined by him in an effort to consolidate power and bring about the life that Julius Caesar probably wanted for him. In that way, Julius Caesar was very successful in teaching him his learnings on how to become an effective leader and an effective ruler. Another thing I really like is, I've been talking about it, but that last third of this book, I really like how cynical Augustus comes off, having seen so much of the world and see all these people fighting for power and seeing the weakness that exists in men's hearts that have led to some destruction in Rome. I like that he's cynical. Like, it shows that he's changed from his youth, and it shows that, you know, that would be the kind of experience you've had if you've been ruling for 40 or so years. And I also like how he's kind of historically vindicated, because we find out that Nero is the future ruler, as the story ends. And Augustus was talking about how, you know, like there's weakness in men's hearts, and Rome might not survive because people are at fault and people are flawed. And yeah, Augustus is kind of right. Everyone after Augustus ended up being such a downer of a ruler, and ultimately Rome fell. Like, the weakness of men was not enough to keep Rome going forever, maybe over multiple different civilizations and kingdoms, but not the Rome that Augustus knew. And that's a very fascinating way to view human history, that maybe we're so flawed that it's impossible to keep the vision of hope and a better Rome, a better tomorrow for everyone possible, because someone's going to come along with weakness in their heart and ruin it for everyone. However, there are a couple of flaws with this book. One of them is that it's revealed that Julia is a part of a sex cult of some sort, where she's viewed as a goddess within the cult and is allowed to have sex with one of the sacrifices. And I know this is intended as a way to show that Julia's like upbringing and the control over her life has been too much, and she's just trying to wrest control back. But it comes off as accidentally funny. Like, she's part of this sex cult. She's been having sex all around Rome, and no one does anything about it. At the same time, Augustus created these laws that are inadvertently going to affect Julia, and it's supposed to be a serious moment that's maybe not funny, and it comes off as too funny. And I do think maybe Williams could have, written it better so that it doesn't sound like a big joke. And then at the same time, a lot of this does feel like weird historical fan fiction, and it's also a little bit boring. Like, at times I found like it was a real slog to get through. But also, like, it's important to remember that these are real people, and this maybe was not what their thought process was. Perhaps Augustus was even cooler than we all think, and he didn't have a hopeful vision for Rome. He only had a hopeful vision for himself and his wallet. And so it ultimately just comes off as like bizarre fan fiction, and kind of written from the perspective of a bunch of whiny rich people who are unhappy that they're not getting their way. And I don't know, like, maybe in the 70s when this was written, that was a very interesting kind of message to send out there. But in 2022, when a bunch of whiny rich people are ruining the world, it comes off as a bit unrelatable. I can't relate to Augustus. Like, I understand what Williams is trying to get at, but at times it's just like I can't relate to any of these characters, and it's a really weird choice to have written the story about actual real characters in that way. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Augustus by John Williams. It's a very fascinating story with a lot in depth to it, but the accidental humor in there and the weird historical fan fiction paired with it it just kind of seems like a misstep to me. Not enough to sink the story, but enough to make it hard for me to recommend it to people out there, which is very disappointing, because I loved John Williams and I was fully hoping for another stoner quality book in Augustus. And in some ways, the third act of the story does deliver, because Stoner had that third act too, where it tied everything together and made the message especially cogent. And here you kind of have that, but I still don't think it fully transcends all of its flaws, which is unfortunate. But if you've read this before, you simply want to comment on something I said here, do so below. Let's have a discussion about Augustus. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this book and this author if they do not already know. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and Roman travels. Farewell.